At 4:47 in the afternoon, he understood that he had made a mistake, not a tactical error, not a miscalculation about distance or timing. He had underestimated how fast they were moving. The patrol was less than 200 meters away, spread wide, systematic, and they were coming directly toward him. He had 6 minutes, maybe less, and the only option left, the only thing that had any chance of working, was the one thing every instinct, every piece of training, every survival reflex he had was screaming at him not to do: stay exactly where he was. The year is 1944, northern France. Late summer. The front lines have collapsed in places no one expected, and the countryside between retreating German forces and advancing Allied units has become a fractured, dangerous in-between, controlled by neither side, watched by both. He is 23 years old, a reconnaissance scout assigned to gather route intelligence ahead of a column that will not arrive until morning. He went in light, alone, on foot. And right now, crouched behind the burned-out shell of a half-track on the edge of what was once a farm road, he is watching a 6-man German patrol execute a sweep pattern less than 200 meters from his position. And closing, he has no radio. His unit does not know his exact location, and he has already ruled out every exit he came in through. Standard protocol for a compromised scout was clear: disengage, fall back along the ingress route. Use terrain for concealment. Move fast, move low, and do not engage. But protocol assumes you have an ingress route left to use. His was gone. He had entered the area from the east, threading through a narrow corridor between 2 tree lines that gave him cover and a clear sight line to the road junction he needed to assess. It had taken him 40 minutes to get into position. The approach was careful. The position was good. What he had not accounted for was the second patrol. While he was observing the junction, a separate unit had moved into the tree line to his east, not searching for him specifically, a routine perimeter check, most likely. But the effect was the same. The corridor he came through was now occupied. Going back meant walking directly into them, so he moved west, away from his ingress, looking for another gap. That was when he found the half-track, a burned-out wreck, half buried in a ditch on the south side of the farm road, surrounded by the debris of whatever engagement had destroyed it weeks earlier. Broken equipment, scattered metal, 2 blown tires fused into the ground. He took the position because it was the only covered ground for 40 meters in any direction. Okay, that was 20 minutes ago. Now the sweep patrol was coming from the north, moving south in a staggered line. 6 men, spaced roughly 10 meters apart, walking slowly, scanning. Running would expose him the moment he cleared the wreck. Open ground on 3 sides. No tree line within a distance he could cross unseen. Hiding beneath the half-track was already what he was doing, but the patrol's sweep angle would bring 2 of them within 15 meters of his position. Close enough that concealment alone would not be enough. If either of them looked directly at him, and he was pressed against the undercarriage, it would be over. Surrendering was not a calculation he allowed himself to finish. Every option he could construct logically ended the same way: capture, or worse. Except one. Every other man in his situation, and there had been others. He knew this. He had heard the debriefs, and the silences that followed had done the same thing. They moved. When the pressure came, when the patrol got close enough that staying felt impossible, they broke. A crawl toward the tree line. A low sprint toward a ditch. Something, anything, because movement felt like agency. Movement felt like survival. And movement was exactly what got them found. A patrol executing a sweep pattern is not looking at every square meter of ground with equal attention. It cannot. The human eye does not work that way, and trained soldiers know it. They are scanning for indicators, shape changes, color anomalies, motion. A sweep pattern is optimized to detect movement. It is built around the assumption that a person under pressure will eventually break and run, because people always break and run. The spacing of the line, the angle of advance, the pace, all of it is calibrated to funnel movement into observable corridors. He had read enough captured field doctrine to understand this. He had also seen enough to believe it. So he did not run. He did not press himself flatter against the undercarriage. Instead, he did something that felt, in that moment, almost irrational. He repositioned himself to the outer edge of the wreck, the side facing the patrol, and he stayed still, completely still, in a position that looked, from a distance, like debris, like part of the wreck, like something already accounted for and dismissed. Not hidden, present, just motionless. The first man in the sweep line was 40 meters out when he stopped moving. He had chosen the position in the last 90 seconds, not with comfort, but with calculation. The half-track's burned chassis angled toward the north, toward the approaching line, and the debris field around it was wide enough that a human shape pressed against it at the right angle would not immediately read as human. The metal was warped. The ground around it was broken by fragments, a collapsed wheel housing, and what had once been a storage crate reduced to charred planks. He was part of that. That was what he told himself. He regulated his breathing the way he had been taught, and had practiced until it stopped feeling like practice. Slow, controlled, diaphragm, not chest. Chest movement was visible at close range under the right light. The afternoon sun was low and coming from the west, which meant the patrol would be walking partially into it. Their visibility toward the east side of the road would be reduced. His position caught shadow from the half-track's hull. He had roughly 3 minutes before the nearest man reached him. He did not move. 20 meters to his right, a crow landed on the road and then lifted off again, almost immediately startled by something. He heard the patrol leader say something low in German, a directive. He could not make out the words clearly, but the response was a single syllable from somewhere down the line. Acknowledgement. They adjusted their spacing slightly, tightened. That was not good. A tighter line meant closer individual passes. It meant the 2 men on the near flank, the men most likely to pass within range of his position, would come through with less distance between them, which reduced the gap in their visual coverage, but also meant they were more likely to be looking at each other's zones rather than their own. He filed that away. 30 meters. The nearest man was walking slowly, rifle across his body, eyes moving, not random, systematic. Ground, horizon, ground, horizon. The pattern of someone doing the job correctly, not someone distracted or tired or cutting corners. He did not move. His left hand was flat against the earth. His right was tucked against his side. Both were still. He had positioned his head at an angle that kept his face out of direct sightline from the north, turned slightly down, the way a person does not naturally hold their head, which meant it would not pattern match to a face at a glance. 20 meters. He could hear boots now. 2 sets. The nearest man and the one 5 meters behind and to his left. The second man was scanning west, toward open ground. The first man was scanning the road and the debris field directly ahead of him. Directly at the half-track, he breathed. In, hold out. 15 meters. The patrol leader called something again, shorter this time. The line slowed almost imperceptibly. A brief hesitation then continued. He could not tell what had caused it. A signal, a hand gesture, something at the far end of the line. He used the hesitation to do nothing differently. That was the discipline. That was the thing training taught you, and the thing instinct fought against every second. When something changed, when a variable shifted, when pressure increased, the body wanted to respond, to adjust, to do something. Doing something would end this. 12 meters, the nearest man stopped. Not because he had seen anything. The patrol leader had raised a fist, a halt signal, visible down the line. The man closest to him stood still, rifle shifting slightly in his hands, eyes moving across the debris field in a slow arc. He was looking directly at the half-track, not at him specifically, at the wreck, taking it in as a whole. The burned chassis, the debris, the broken ground. The way wrecks look, after weeks of weather and scavenging and stillness, collapsed into themselves. Stripped of the quality that makes machinery look purposeful, he was categorizing it. He held his breath. Not because breathing would be audible at 12 meters. Because it was the only thing left to control. The man's eyes moved on, continued west, settled briefly on the open ground beyond the road, found nothing. The halt signal dropped. The line began moving again. 10 meters. 9. The nearest man walked past the front edge of the half-track at 8 meters. His gaze now shifted south, toward the direction of travel. The second man passed at 11 meters, eyes west. Neither looked back. 8 meters became 15. 15 became 25. He did not move. The patrol continued south. He counted their steps. Not by sound alone, but by the way the sound changed the particular quality of boots on packed earth. Shifting to boots on looser ground as they crossed the edge of the farm road and moved into the field beyond. 40 meters south, he did not move. 60 meters. He adjusted his breathing back to a normal rhythm. He did not change his position. He did not look up to track them visually. Looking up meant movement of the head, and movement at distance was still visible. And the patrol leader had not dismissed the sweep. They were continuing, not disbanding. He needed another 4 minutes before the patrol would be far enough south that movement on his part would be below their detection threshold. He counted, not seconds. He had learned that counting seconds under stress was inaccurate. The internal clock accelerated with adrenaline, and what felt like 60 seconds was often 35. He counted breaths instead, at the controlled rate he had established. 14 breaths per minute. Regulated. He counted 256 breaths. 4 minutes. During that time, the patrol reached the far edge of the field and halted again briefly at what he assumed was a road junction or a boundary marker. The patrol leader conferred with the man nearest him. Then the line broke, not a dispersal, a formation shift. They were grouping for movement elsewhere, not returning north. At 56 breaths, he moved for the first time in 11 minutes. Not fast. Not urgently. He shifted his weight off his left side, the side that had been pressed against the earth, and allowed the blood to return to his forearm in a slow, controlled process. He did not stand. He did not change his silhouette against the half-track. He simply rearranged the distribution of his weight. And then he waited again, because there was a second problem. The patrol to the east, the one in the tree line, the one that had closed his ingress route, had not moved. He had heard nothing from them in the last 20 minutes, which meant either they had gone deeper into the tree line and were now out of earshot, or they were still at the edge of it, static, positioned. He did not know which, and he could not find out without exposing himself. He had perhaps 90 minutes of usable light left. After that, moving cross-country in this terrain in the dark, without a route, without radio contact, and with active patrols in 2 directions, was not a plan. It was an outcome. He needed information. He waited 3 more minutes, counting breaths, watching the southern field, tracking the patrol's sound signature, and then very slowly, by increments, he raised his head until he had a sight line to the east tree line. 230 meters. The tree line was dark and still. He watched it for 90 seconds without blinking more than necessary. Nothing moved, which told him almost nothing. The light was dropping faster than he had calculated. He had been in position for nearly 50 minutes now. The western sky had shifted from pale gold to something deeper and less useful, and the shadows across the field were lengthening in a way that would soon work in his favor, but not yet. Not for another 20 minutes at least. In the interim, there was a specific window of Langle light that would actually make him more visible to anyone watching from the east, not less. The sun catching his profile against the darker metal of the half-track. He lowered his head again and thought, the patrol from the north had gone south. They were not his problem anymore, or not his immediate problem. The tree line to the east was unknown, present or cleared. He could not determine. His egress remained blocked until he had better information or better light. Then he heard it, a single sound from the east tree line. Not a voice. Not movement in the conventional sense. A branch, displaced at roughly shoulder height, the kind of contact a person makes when standing still for a long time and shifting weight without thinking about it. Someone was still there. He placed the sound at approximately 180 meters, close to the edge of the tree line, not deep in it. A sentry position, most likely, 1 man, possibly 2. Watching the open ground between the tree line and the farm road. Watching exactly the ground he would have to cross. He had perhaps 45 minutes of light left. He ran the calculation and did not like the result. Crossing that ground in the remaining light, with a static observer at the edge of the tree line, was not feasible. The open distance was too wide, the terrain too flat. Even low and slow, a moving human shape against open ground in late afternoon light would register. He would have to wait for darkness, which meant he would have to stay in this position for another 45 minutes. Minimum past the point where his unit would begin to expect his return, past the window they would hold before pulling the forward element back, past the margin that made his intelligence useful for the morning movement. He accepted this without any particular emotion. Acceptance was not the same as resignation. Acceptance was what allowed him to keep working the problem, instead of reacting to the version of it that frightened him most. He resettled his weight. He controlled his breathing. He monitored the tree line by sound, and he waited. 20 minutes later, the branch moved again. Same location, same quality of sound. Idle displacement, not deliberate movement. The observer was still there, but not active. Not scanning aggressively. A sentry on a routine post, watching open ground that had shown him nothing in the last hour. His attention beginning to drift, the way attention always drifted after sustained observation of nothing. He noted this. He began to think about the window, the specific 2-minute span that would open when the light dropped below the critical angle, when the sentry's visual field degraded, when the half-track shadow extended, far enough east to give him partial cover for the first 40 meters of any crossing attempt. He calculated the timing. He decided he would move in 31 minutes. And then, 14 minutes later, he heard a second sound from the tree line that recalibrated everything. A second voice, low, close to the first, and then the particular sound of 2 men beginning to move. Not a patrol sweep, but a withdrawal. The careful noise of a sentry position being quietly vacated. They were pulling back. Changing the watch, or ending it entirely, he could not tell. But they were moving away from the edge of the tree line, and deeper into it, which meant the open ground between him and the eastern approach was, for a window of unknown duration, unobserved. He did not hesitate. He moved. Later, when he tried to reconstruct exactly what the patrol had been looking for, what their doctrine had assumed about the ground they were sweeping, the answer was straightforward enough that it was almost uncomfortable. They were looking for a man who was running. Every element of the sweep pattern confirmed it. The spacing of the line was designed to funnel movement, not to identify static positions. The pace was designed to pressure, to force a decision, to create the moment where someone in hiding concludes that holding still is no longer tenable and breaks into the open. The half-track had been part of their sweep count. He knew this because of the way the nearest man had looked at it, the particular quality of attention that means catalogued and dismissed. The wreck was a known variable in their environment, a shape that was already there when the patrol began, something that existed before they arrived, and therefore, implicitly, something that did not require further analysis. The error was in the premise. Their doctrine assumed that anything dangerous would be moving, that the threat signature they were sweeping for was a man trying to escape. And escape means motion. Motion is what sweep patterns are built to find. He had never entered the pattern. He had been still when they arrived, still while they passed, and still for the 4 minutes after they cleared his position. He had not attempted to be invisible. He had attempted to be irrelevant, to be a shape that matched the environment, closely enough that the brain scanning for threat signatures would process him and continue. The sentry at the tree line had operated under the same assumption. He was watching for the crossing, the moment someone attempted to move through the open ground. He had watched open ground that showed him nothing, and over time had reduced his attention accordingly. Both of them had been disciplined, trained, and operating correctly within their doctrine. And doctrine, in this case, had a gap. A man who understands what the searcher is looking for, and who refuses to provide it, does not disappear. He simply stops being findable. By the time he crossed the open ground, it was dark enough that his shape dissolved into the field before he reached the midpoint. He moved slowly, not cautiously, slowly, with precision. The difference mattered. Caution produces irregular movement, hesitation, the kind of stop-start motion that reads as human even in poor light. He moved at a fixed pace, low, with the particular economy of someone who has decided exactly what he is doing and is doing only that. He reached the tree line in 4 minutes. He did not stop there. He moved through it, east, for another 20 minutes without pausing, without looking back, until the terrain began to rise slightly and he recognized the ridge feature that told him where he was relative to his unit's last known position. He found them 40 minutes later. The patrol report he gave was accurate and complete. Route, viability, forced disposition at the junction, estimated strength of the units he had observed, patrol patterns, timing. His commanding officer asked him once why he had taken so long. He gave a brief answer. The officer nodded and moved on to the intelligence itself, which was what mattered that night. No one asked about the half-track. After the war, he rarely talked about that afternoon. Not because it was the worst thing he had seen. It was not by a significant distance. And not because it was particularly heroic. He had never thought of it that way, and would not have accepted the description if offered. He talked about it occasionally, in the last years of his life, when the subject of decision-making came up. Not war specifically, just decisions. What he said, more than once, was this: the hardest thing to do when everything is moving against you is to stop. Not give up, not surrender, not accept defeat. Stop. To hold absolutely still while the pressure builds, and the instincts fire, and every reasonable part of your mind is constructing arguments for why movement is survival. And to understand, clearly, that those arguments are exactly what the situation is designed to produce. He said that the men who found him most reliably, across all the years, and all the terrain, and all the different variations of the same problem, were never the ones who worked hardest. They were the ones who understood what they were looking for. And the only way to survive, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, was to stop being the thing they were looking for. He died in 1991. He had lived a quiet life after the war, worked ordinary work, raised a family that knew almost none of this. The afternoon by the half-track lasted perhaps 3 hours. He never considered it remarkable. That, more than anything else, is probably why it worked.